Picture this. 3 popular kids corner a quiet boy behind the school gymnasium. Phones recording, demanding he get down on all fours and bark like a dog for their entertainment. They're laughing, thinking they found the perfect victim to humiliate for their social media feeds. What they don't know is that in exactly 20 seconds, their laughter will turn to tears, and their victim will become their greatest nightmare. This is the story of Danny Hayes, and what happened when Connor Mitchell made the biggest mistake of his teenage life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn rain drummed against the windows of Riverside High School as students hurried through the main hallway, their voices echoing off the polished floors. Among them moved Daniel Hayes, his shoulders hunched slightly forward as he navigated through the crowd with practiced invisibility. At 16, Danny had perfected the art of being unremarkable. His brown hair fell across his forehead in unkempt waves, partially obscuring eyes that seemed perpetually focused on the ground ahead of him. His clothes hung loose on his lean frame, a deliberate choice that made him appear smaller and less noticeable than he actually was. Danny clutched his worn backpack straps as he weaved between groups of chattering students, each step calculated to avoid drawing attention. He had been at Riverside High for exactly 3 weeks now, ever since his family had moved from Portland, and in that short time he had already established himself as the kid who didn't quite fit anywhere. It wasn't that he was particularly small or weak-looking, standing at an average height with a wiry build that suggested he wasn't entirely sedentary. But there was something about his careful movements, his reluctance to make eye contact, and his habit of speaking only when directly addressed that marked him as different in the eyes of his new classmates. What none of them knew, what Danny worked very hard to ensure they would never discover, was that beneath his baggy clothing and quiet demeanor lay the body of someone who had spent years conditioning himself for combat. His seemingly nervous, fidgeting masked hands that had been trained to move with lightning precision, and his downcast eyes actually tracked every movement around him with the awareness of someone who had learned to read danger in the smallest of gestures. The careful way he moved through crowds wasn't born of timidity, but rather of a discipline so ingrained that avoiding unnecessary contact had become second nature. Danny's mother had made him promise before they left Portland that he would keep his past buried. The incident that had forced their family to relocate still haunted her dreams, and she couldn't bear the thought of her son being placed in another situation where his training might surface. She had enrolled him in martial arts as a child simply to build his confidence, never imagining that her quiet, bookish son would display such natural aptitude for combat sports that he would eventually train under some of the most respected instructors on the West Coast. The promise he had made to her weighed heavily on his conscience every day, especially when he encountered situations where every instinct told him to act. As Danny made his way toward his locker, he remained blissfully unaware that he was being observed by Connor Mitchell, who stood near the trophy case with his 2 closest friends, Blake Torres and Ryan Kim. Connor cut an impressive figure at 17. His athletic build earned through years of lacrosse training and his confident posture radiating the kind of easy dominance that came from never having been seriously challenged. His blonde hair was styled with the casual perfection that suggested both effort and the means to achieve it, and his clothes bore the subtle logos of expensive brands that marked him as part of Riverside's social elite. Connor had noticed the new kid almost immediately upon his arrival at school, not because Danny stood out, but precisely because he tried so hard not to. There was something about Danny's determined invisibility that triggered Connor's predatory instincts, a quality he had inherited from years of identifying and exploiting weakness in others. Connor's popularity wasn't built solely on his athletic achievements or his family's wealth, though both certainly contributed to his status. Instead, it was his ability to create entertainment at others' expense, documented and shared across social media platforms that had earned him his reputation as someone not to cross. Blake Torres, standing to Connor's left, possessed the kind of easy athleticism that made him a natural fit for the basketball team. His dark hair was cropped short in a style that emphasized his strong jawline, and his broad shoulders filled out his Letterman jacket in a way that announced his athletic credentials to anyone who looked his way. Blake's loyalty to Connor ran deeper than simple friendship. It was born of a mutual understanding that their alliance benefited them both. While Connor provided the charisma and the ideas, Blake brought the physical presence that made their schemes possible and the social weight of his own athletic achievements that legitimized Connor's actions in the eyes of their peers. Ryan Kim completed their trio, his slight build and tech-savvy nature making him the perfect accomplice for their digital age harassment campaigns. Ryan's role was crucial in their operations. He was the one who captured their exploits on camera, edited the footage to maximize impact, and distributed it across social media platforms where their humiliation of others could reach the widest possible audience. His quick fingers were as skilled with a smartphone camera as they were with a computer keyboard, and he had developed an almost artistic eye for framing shots that would generate the most engagement from their followers. The three had been discussing their next target when Danny inadvertently provided them with the perfect opportunity. As he reached his locker and began working the combination, his backpack had shifted, revealing a small corner of what appeared to be a worn photograph tucked into one of the side pockets. The image was partially obscured, but Connor's sharp eyes caught what looked like Danny in some kind of uniform, though the distance and angle made it impossible to determine what kind. "Check out the new kid," Connor murmured to his friends, nodding in Danny's direction. 3 weeks here, and he still acts like he's afraid of his own shadow. Blake followed Connor's gaze and shrugged. "Maybe he's just shy." "Some people are like that." "Nobody's that shy naturally," Connor replied, his tone carrying the confidence of someone who had made a study of human nature, at least as it applied to high school social dynamics. "He's hiding something. Look how he moves like he's trying to disappear. That's not shyness, that's fear." Ryan, who had been scrolling through his phone, looked up with interest. "Fear of what?" "That's what we're going to find out," Connor said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "I bet if we apply the right kind of pressure, our mysterious new friend will crack like an egg. And when he does, we'll be there to capture every second of it." The plan that began forming in Connor's mind was relatively simple, at least in its initial stages. They would start with small provocations, little incidents designed to test Danny's reactions and establish their dominance over him. Connor had perfected this approach over the years, understanding that the key to successful bullying in the social media age was to create content that appeared spontaneous and entertaining, while ensuring that any adult who might intervene would see only harmless teenage pranks rather than systematic harassment. As Danny closed his locker and shouldered his backpack, completely unaware of the attention he had attracted, Connor exchanged meaningful glances with Blake and Ryan. They had found their next project, and something told Connor that this one was going to be more interesting than most. There was something about Danny's determined effort to remain invisible that suggested he had secrets worth uncovering, and Connor had built his reputation on his ability to expose the vulnerabilities that people worked hardest to hide. The first period bell rang, sending students scurrying toward their respective classrooms, but Connor remained by the trophy case for a moment longer, watching as Danny disappeared into the crowd. He had learned to trust his instincts about people, and those instincts were telling him that beneath Danny's carefully constructed facade lay something that would make excellent content for his social media empire. The only question was how much pressure it would take to crack that facade and reveal what lay beneath. Connor's followers on various social media platforms numbered in the thousands, an impressive figure for a high school student that he had built through a combination of athletic highlights, party documentation, and increasingly elaborate pranks performed on his fellow students. His content had evolved over time from simple sports footage to more complex scenarios designed to generate maximum engagement from his audience. The humiliation videos performed particularly well, often garnering tens of thousands of views and hundreds of comments from viewers who seemed to take vicarious pleasure in watching others be brought low. The success of his online presence had become addictive for Connor, feeding a need for validation and attention that went deeper than simple teenage narcissism. Each new video had to top the previous one in terms of creativity and impact, pushing him to devise increasingly elaborate schemes to maintain his audience's interest. The arrival of a new student who so clearly wanted to avoid attention presented an irresistible opportunity to create content that would set a new standard for his channel. As he finally headed toward his first period class, Connor was already mentally cataloging what he knew about Danny and planning the initial stages of what he expected would be a campaign that would provide content for weeks to come. He had no way of knowing that in targeting Danny Hayes, he had chosen someone whose secrets ran far deeper and darker than anything he had encountered before, and that his usual tactics of exposure and humiliation might not produce the results he expected. The morning progressed normally for Danny, who attended his classes with the same quiet diligence he had displayed since arriving at Riverside High. He took careful notes, participated only when directly called upon, and continued his policy of avoiding unnecessary interaction with his classmates. During the breaks between classes, he moved quickly through the hallways, keeping his head down and his pace brisk enough to discourage casual conversation while remaining slow enough to avoid drawing attention through speed. It was during lunch period that Connor made his first move, a seemingly innocent encounter that was designed to test Danny's reactions while appearing completely accidental to any observers. Danny had chosen a table in the far corner of the cafeteria, as had become his habit, positioning himself where he could observe the room while remaining relatively isolated from the main flow of student traffic. He unpacked his lunch methodically, the same simple sandwich and piece of fruit that his mother packed for him every morning, and began eating while reviewing notes from his morning classes. Connor approached with Blake and Ryan in tow, their movements casual enough to suggest they were simply walking past Danny's table on their way to somewhere else. As they drew near, Connor deliberately bumped into Danny's chair, causing him to lurch forward slightly and nearly knock over his water bottle. The contact was brief and could easily have been explained as an accident, but Connor's quick reflexes allowed him to steady the water bottle before it could fall, creating the appearance of a helpful gesture. "Sorry about that," Connor said, with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Didn't see you there. You're the new kid, right?" "Danny?" Danny looked up from his lunch, meeting Connor's gaze for just a moment before dropping his eyes back to his food. "It's fine," he said, quietly. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. No harm done. I'm Connor," he continued, gesturing to his friends. "This is Blake and Ryan. We haven't had a chance to properly welcome you to Riverside yet." The exchange was brief and superficially polite, but Danny could sense the undercurrent of something else in Connor's tone and body language. Years of training had taught him to read the subtle signs that indicated when someone was evaluating him as a potential threat or target, and every instinct he possessed was telling him that this encounter was not as innocent as it appeared. Connor's smile was too practiced, his friends positioned too strategically, and the timing of their approach felt too calculated to be coincidental. "Thanks," Danny replied, his voice steady but offering no encouragement for continued conversation. "I appreciate that." Connor seemed to sense Danny's reluctance to engage, but rather than being discouraged, he appeared to find it interesting. "So where did you transfer from?" he asked, settling uninvited into the chair across from Danny with the casual presumption of someone accustomed to having his presence welcomed everywhere. "Portland," Danny answered simply, taking another bite of his sandwich and hoping that brevity would discourage further questions. "Portland's a long way from Ohio," Blake observed, leaning against the table with studied casualness. "That must have been a big change for your family." Danny nodded without elaborating his discomfort, with the line of questioning becoming more apparent despite his efforts to remain neutral. The three boys exchanged glances that suggested some kind of silent communication was taking place, and Danny found himself wishing he had chosen to eat lunch in the library instead of the cafeteria. "Well," Connor said finally, standing up with the same easy confidence he had displayed throughout the encounter, "if you ever want to hang out or need someone to show you around town, just let us know. Riverside can be a pretty boring place if you don't know where to look for entertainment." The comment carried an undertone that made Danny look up sharply, but Connor's expression remained pleasantly neutral. As the three boys walked away, Danny could hear them talking quietly among themselves, though he couldn't make out their words over the general noise of the cafeteria. Something about their departure felt more like a strategic withdrawal than a natural end to the conversation, and Danny spent the remainder of his lunch period trying to shake the feeling that he had just been evaluated and found wanting in some way that would prove problematic for him in the future. The rest of the day passed without incident, but Danny remained alert for any sign that his encounter with Connor and his friends had been something more than a simple introduction. His experience with bullies in Portland had taught him to recognize the patterns of behavior that typically preceded more serious harassment, and several elements of his lunchtime conversation had triggered warning signals that he couldn't ignore. The way Connor had positioned himself in the chair across from him, claiming space and establishing dominance through physical presence, was a classic intimidation tactic. Blake's positioning against the table had effectively blocked one of Danny's potential exit routes, while Ryan had remained standing in a spot that would have made it difficult for Danny to leave without asking them to move. More concerning than their physical positioning, however, was the nature of their questions and the way they had responded to his answers. Connor's inquiry about his previous school and Blake's comment about the distance from Portland suggested they were fishing for information about why his family had relocated. Danny had encountered this kind of probing before, and he knew from experience that it often preceded attempts to uncover embarrassing or compromising information that could be used against him later. As he walked to his final class of the day, Danny found himself reviewing everything he knew about Connor Mitchell and trying to assess the level of threat he might represent. Connor's reputation as a popular athlete and social media personality was well established, but Danny had also heard rumors about his involvement in various pranks and incidents involving other students. The stories were usually told with a mixture of admiration and nervousness, suggesting that Connor's actions were viewed as entertaining by some, but potentially dangerous by others, who understood they could easily become targets themselves. The final bell of the day rang, releasing students into the autumn afternoon, and Danny gathered his belongings with the same methodical care he brought to everything else. His bus wouldn't arrive for another 20 minutes, giving him time to stop by his locker and retrieve the books he would need for homework that evening. The hallways were emptying rapidly as students headed toward buses, cars, or after-school activities, and Danny appreciated the reduced crowd density that made navigation easier and less stressful. As he reached his locker and began working the combination, Danny became aware of footsteps approaching from behind him. The sound was too deliberate to be someone simply passing by, and when he glanced over his shoulder, he saw Connor, Blake, and Ryan walking toward him with the same casual confidence they had displayed at lunch. This time, however, their approach felt different, more purposeful, and less concerned with maintaining the appearance of coincidental encounter. Connor Mitchell had built his kingdom at Riverside High through a careful combination of athletic prowess, social media savvy, and an intuitive understanding of the adolescent hunger for entertainment at someone else's expense. His domain extended far beyond the lacrosse field, where he had earned his initial recognition as a standout player. In the 2 years since he had begun documenting his exploits online, Connor had transformed himself from merely another popular athlete into something approaching a local celebrity, with followers throughout the school and even in neighboring districts who eagerly awaited his latest content. The foundation of Connor's power rested on his ability to identify and exploit the social hierarchies that governed teenage life. He understood instinctively that high school operated on a complex system of status markers, from the clothes students wore to the tables they sat at during lunch, and he had positioned himself at the apex of this system through a series of calculated moves that had begun in his freshman year. His family's wealth provided the initial advantages, but Connor had leveraged those advantages into something much more substantial through his willingness to take risks and his talent for creating memorable moments that others would discuss long after they occurred. Blake Torres represented the perfect lieutenant for Connor's operation, bringing his own substantial athletic credentials and social standing to their partnership while possessing the kind of unquestioning loyalty that made him invaluable as an enforcer of Connor's will. Blake's family had moved to Millbrook when he was in middle school, and he had struggled initially to find his place in the established social order until Connor had recognized his potential and taken him under his wing. The debt of gratitude that Blake felt toward Connor for this early intervention had evolved over time into something approaching worship, making him willing to participate in increasingly elaborate schemes without questioning their morality or consequences. Blake's physical presence added credibility to Connor's threats and made resistance seem futile to their targets. Standing nearly 6 feet tall with the broad shoulders and muscled frame of a serious athlete, Blake could intimidate through his mere presence without ever having to resort to actual violence. His basketball skills had earned him recognition throughout the region, and college scouts had already begun expressing interest in his potential, giving him a status that was independent of but complementary to Connor's own reputation. This combination of physical intimidation and social standing made Blake the perfect enforcer for Connor's increasingly elaborate pranks and humiliation campaigns. Ryan Kim brought a different but equally valuable set of skills to their triumvirate, serving as the technical specialist who transformed their activities from simple pranks into viral content that could reach audiences far beyond the walls of Riverside High. Ryan's expertise with video editing, social media algorithms, and digital distribution had turned Connor's natural charisma into a genuine online brand that generated real influence and, increasingly, actual revenue through sponsorships and ad-sharing programs. Ryan's slight build and quiet demeanor made him easy to overlook, which served their purposes perfectly, as he could document their activities without drawing attention to himself or alerting potential victims to the fact that their humiliation was being recorded for posterity. The three had developed their system over months of trial and error, refining their approach until they had created what amounted to a content production machine that could identify targets, devise appropriate scenarios, and execute elaborate pranks with the efficiency of a professional operation. Ryan's analytics showed them which types of content performed best with their audience, allowing them to tailor their activities to maximize engagement and reach. Humiliation videos consistently outperformed other content, particularly when they featured victims who appeared to be genuinely distressed or when the humiliation involved some element of physical comedy that could be replayed and shared across platforms. Connor's approach to target selection had become increasingly sophisticated as his understanding of social dynamics deepened. He had learned to identify students who possessed certain vulnerability markers that made them ideal subjects for his content creation efforts. Shy students were obvious choices, but Connor had discovered that the most successful campaigns often targeted individuals who had something to hide or who were struggling to maintain a carefully constructed persona. The resulting content was more engaging because the audience could sense the authentic distress of the victim, and the revelation of hidden secrets or the destruction of carefully maintained facades created narrative tension that kept viewers engaged throughout longer videos. Danny Hayes had triggered every one of Connor's instincts about profitable targets from the moment he had first noticed him in the hallway. The new student's obvious efforts to remain invisible suggested secrets worth uncovering, while his careful body language and hyper-vigilant awareness indicated someone who had reason to fear exposure. Connor's experience had taught him that students who worked hardest to avoid attention were often the ones who had the most interesting stories to tell. And his initial interaction with Danny at lunch had only reinforced his conviction that he had found something special. The afternoon following their first encounter, Connor convened a strategy session with Blake and Ryan in his bedroom, a space that had been transformed into something resembling a content creation studio. Multiple monitors displayed social media feeds, analytics dashboards, and video editing software, while professional lighting equipment and camera mounts indicated the serious nature of Connor's online activities. The walls were decorated with framed screenshots of his most successful posts, including several that featured previous victims in various states of humiliation and distress. "I've been thinking about our new friend Danny," Connor began, settling into his desk chair and pulling up his notes on his laptop. "There's definitely something there, but we're going to need to be more strategic than usual. He's not like the other targets we've worked with." Blake, sprawled across Connor's bed, looked up from his phone with interest. "What makes you think that? He seemed pretty standard to me. Quiet, nervous, probably gets good grades and stays out of trouble." "That's exactly what I mean," Connor replied, turning his monitor so Blake could see the screen. "Look at this footage Ryan shot during lunch yesterday. Watch how he moves, how he positions himself, the way his eyes track movement around the room. That's not normal shy kid behavior." Ryan, who had been reviewing the previous day's analytics on his own laptop, pulled up the lunch footage and began playing it back in slow motion. "Connor's right," he said after studying the video for several minutes. "See how he chooses his seat? Perfect visibility of all entrances, back to the wall, clear exit routes. And watch his hands when we approach. They move into what looks almost like a defensive position before he catches himself and relaxes them." "Exactly," Connor said, his excitement growing as he explained his theory. "This kid has training of some kind. Military family maybe, or martial arts, or something like that. But for some reason, he's hiding it. The question is why." Blake sat up straighter, his interest fully engaged now. "So what's the plan? How do we get him to reveal whatever he's hiding?" Connor's smile carried a predatory quality that his online followers would have recognized from his most successful content. "We apply pressure gradually, document everything, and wait for him to crack. But we need to be smart about it. If I'm right about him having some kind of training, we can't just rely on physical intimidation. We need to attack his psychological defenses, make him feel isolated and exposed until he has no choice but to show us who he really is." The plan that emerged from their discussion was more elaborate than their usual operations, designed to unfold over several weeks in a series of escalating encounters that would each provide content, while building toward a climactic confrontation that Connor expected would generate their most successful video yet. Ryan would document everything from multiple angles, creating a comprehensive record of Danny's psychological breakdown that could be edited into a multi-part series for maximum impact and engagement. The first phase of their campaign began the following morning as Danny made his way through the crowded hallway toward his first period class. Connor had positioned himself near Danny's locker, timing his arrival to coincide with Danny's morning routine. As Danny approached and began working his combination, Connor initiated what appeared to be a casual conversation with Blake. speaking just loudly enough to ensure that Danny would overhear. "I heard the new kid used to go to some fancy private school in Portland," Connor said, his voice carrying clearly over the ambient noise of the hallway. "Makes you wonder why someone would transfer from a place like that to come here. Must have been some kind of trouble." Blake played his part perfectly, responding with just the right amount of curiosity to make their conversation seem natural. "What kind of trouble do you think? Academic? Disciplinary?" "Hard to say," Connor replied, glancing meaningfully in Danny's direction. "But people don't usually leave expensive private schools to come to public school unless something forces their hand." Danny's shoulders tensed slightly as he listened to their conversation, and Connor noted with satisfaction that his opening gambit had found its mark. The suggestion that Danny had attended private school was pure speculation, but Connor had learned that the specific details mattered less than the implication that secrets existed to be uncovered. The important thing was to establish in Danny's mind that Connor was actively investigating his background and might uncover information that Danny preferred to keep hidden. Over the following days, Connor and his friends maintained a constant but subtle presence in Danny's peripheral vision, appearing at moments when Danny thought he was unobserved and creating the impression of surveillance without engaging in obvious stalking behavior. Ryan documented these encounters from a distance, building a library of footage that captured Danny's growing discomfort and hypervigilance. The cumulative effect of this psychological pressure was exactly what Connor had hoped for, as Danny became increasingly isolated and paranoid, spending more time looking over his shoulder and less time engaging with his academic work or attempting to form social connections. The second phase of their operation began during Danny's third week at Riverside High, when Connor decided to escalate from psychological pressure to direct confrontation. He had been monitoring Danny's routine and had identified several opportunities for encounters that would appear accidental while allowing for maximum impact. Danny's habit of eating lunch alone in the corner of the cafeteria provided the perfect opportunity for a more aggressive approach that would be visible to other students, while maintaining plausible deniability if questioned by faculty. Connor approached Danny's table during the busiest part of lunch period, when the cafeteria was crowded and noisy enough to provide cover for a more confrontational interaction. This time he didn't bother with the pretense of accidental contact, instead pulling out the chair across from Danny and sitting down without invitation, his body language radiating casual aggression. "We need to talk," Connor said, his voice low but carrying an unmistakable edge of menace. "I've been asking around about you, Danny, and I'm hearing some interesting stories." Danny looked up from his lunch, meeting Connor's gaze directly for the first time since their initial encounter. "I don't know what you think you've heard, but I'm not interested in whatever game you're playing." The response surprised Connor with its directness and the hint of steel beneath Danny's usually soft-spoken manner. Rather than being discouraged, however, Connor found himself even more intrigued by the suggestion that Danny might possess more backbone than his careful demeanor suggested. "Game?" Connor repeated, his smile taking on a sharper edge. "This isn't a game, Danny. This is about truth. About finding out who you really are underneath all that fake shy guy act you've been putting on since you got here." Blake and Ryan had positioned themselves strategically around the table, creating a triangle of intimidation that prevented Danny from leaving without directly confronting one of them. Other students in the cafeteria had begun to notice the interaction, and Connor could see phones being discreetly raised to capture whatever was about to unfold. Danny's hands remained steady as he continued eating, but Connor could see the tension in his shoulders and the way his eyes had begun tracking the positions of all three boys with the kind of tactical awareness that confirmed Connor's suspicions about his background. "There's nothing fake about wanting to be left alone," Danny replied. "Maybe you should try minding your own business for a change." The suggestion that Connor should back down, delivered in front of an audience of their peers, represented exactly the kind of challenge that Connor's reputation was built on confronting and defeating. He could feel the attention of nearby students focusing on their table, and he knew that his response to Danny's defiance would be scrutinized and discussed throughout the school within hours. Left alone? Connor laughed, the sound carrying enough volume to ensure that surrounding tables could hear him clearly. "That's not how this works, Danny. You came to our school. You're sitting in our cafeteria. You're part of our community now, whether you like it or not. And in this community, we like to know who we're dealing with." Danny set down his sandwich and looked directly at Connor, his expression calm, but his eyes carrying a warning that made Connor's pulse quicken with anticipation. "You don't know me," Danny said quietly. "And you don't want to know me. Trust me on that." The threat was subtle but unmistakable, and Connor felt a thrill of excitement as he realized that Danny was finally beginning to reveal the steel beneath his carefully constructed facade. This was exactly the kind of content that his audience craved, the moment when the victim's mask began to slip and their true nature started to emerge. "Is that supposed to scare me?" Connor asked, his voice rising slightly to ensure maximum audience participation. "Because I have to tell you, Danny, I'm not seeing anything particularly scary about a skinny kid who won't even make eye contact most of the time." The insult was calculated to provoke a reaction, and Connor watched with professional interest as Danny's jaw tightened and his breathing shifted into a more controlled pattern. These were the subtle signs that Connor had learned to recognize as indicators that his target was approaching their breaking point, and he pressed his advantage with the confidence of someone who had never encountered resistance he couldn't overcome. "Maybe the problem is that you're not looking hard enough," Danny replied, his voice still quiet, but carrying an undertone that made several nearby students stop their conversations to listen more closely. Connor leaned forward across the table, invading Danny's personal space with deliberate aggression. "Then why don't you show me what I'm missing? Stop hiding behind this act and let us see who you really are." The challenge hung in the air between them like a gauntlet thrown down, and Connor could feel the electricity of anticipation from their audience as everyone waited to see how Danny would respond. This was the moment that Connor had been building toward, the psychological pressure point where his targets typically either broke down completely or lashed out in ways that provided excellent content for his social media channels. Danny stood up slowly, his movements controlled and deliberate as he gathered his lunch items and placed them back in his bag. For a moment, Connor thought he might be preparing to flee, which would represent a victory of sorts, but not the dramatic confrontation that would generate the most engaging content. Instead, Danny leaned down slightly, bringing his face close enough to Connor's that only he could hear what Danny said next. "You have no idea what you're playing with," Danny whispered, his voice carrying a coldness that made Connor's skin prickle with something that might have been fear if he had been capable of recognizing it as such. "But if you keep pushing, you're going to find out." Danny straightened up and walked away from the table without looking back, leaving Connor sitting there with the frustrated realization that their confrontation had ended without the dramatic payoff he had been hoping for. The audience of students began to disperse, their attention moving on to other distractions, and Connor found himself in the unfamiliar position of having issued a challenge that had been neither accepted nor definitively rejected. Blake and Ryan gathered around Connor's chair, their expressions reflecting their confusion about what had just transpired. "What did he say to you?" Blake asked, his voice low enough to avoid being overheard by lingering students. Connor remained seated for a moment longer, replaying Danny's words in his mind and trying to analyze the implications of what he had heard. The threat had been delivered with a conviction that suggested Danny genuinely believed he possessed the ability to back up his words. But Connor's experience with teenage bravado made him skeptical that the quiet new kid could represent any real danger to someone with his advantages and connections. "He thinks he's tougher than he looks," Connor replied finally, standing up and brushing imaginary lint from his shirt with studied casualness. Which just makes this more interesting. We're going to have to get more creative if we want to crack this particular nut. Ryan had been recording the entire encounter from a discreet distance, and he showed Connor the footage on his phone as they walked toward their next class. The video quality was excellent, capturing both the subtle body language cues that Connor had learned to read and the moment of tension when Danny had leaned in to deliver his whispered threat. With proper editing, Ryan believed they could create compelling content even from this inconclusive encounter, building audience anticipation for whatever would come next. The audio isn't great for what he said at the end, Ryan noted as they reviewed the footage together. But we can work with that. Maybe add some dramatic music, do some close-ups on facial expressions. The audience will fill in the gaps with their imagination. Connor nodded absently, his mind already working on the next phase of their campaign. Danny's response had been more sophisticated than he had expected, suggesting that Connor would need to escalate more dramatically if he wanted to provoke the kind of breakdown that would provide truly viral content. The whispered threat had been an interesting development, indicating that Danny might possess more fight than Connor had initially assessed, but it also represented a line that had been drawn in the sand. The question now was whether Connor was prepared to cross that line and accept whatever consequences might follow. His reputation had been built on his willingness to push boundaries that others respected, and backing down from Danny's challenge would represent a significant blow to his carefully constructed image. At the same time, something about Danny's demeanor during their confrontation had triggered warning signals that Connor wasn't entirely prepared to ignore. As they reached their classroom and took their seats, Connor made the decision that would set the course for everything that followed. He would escalate his campaign against Danny Hayes, pushing harder and more aggressively until he achieved the dramatic confrontation that his audience expected and his reputation demanded. Whatever secrets Danny was hiding, whatever strength he thought he possessed, Connor was confident that sustained psychological pressure and social isolation would eventually break down any defenses that a 17-year-old could construct. He had no way of knowing that in making this decision, he had committed himself to a course of action that would test not only Danny's ability to maintain his carefully constructed facade, but also Connor's own understanding of the forces he was attempting to manipulate. The game he thought he was playing operated by rules that Danny had never agreed to follow, and the stakes were about to become higher than anyone involved could have anticipated. The remainder of the week passed in a series of increasingly aggressive encounters as Connor systematically escalated his harassment campaign. Danny found himself confronted in hallways, followed between classes, and subjected to a constant stream of provocative comments and challenges that were designed to break down his psychological defenses. Each incident was carefully orchestrated to appear spontaneous while being strategically documented by Ryan's ever-present cameras. Danny's response to this pressure campaign revealed the depth of his self-discipline and the strength of his commitment to the promise he had made to his mother. Despite obvious signs of mounting stress, he refused to be drawn into the confrontations that Connor was attempting to create, instead maintaining his quiet demeanor while demonstrating an almost supernatural ability to avoid situations where the harassment might escalate into physical violence. This restraint, rather than discouraging Connor, only served to increase his determination to break through Danny's defenses. Connor interpreted Danny's refusal to fight back as evidence of weakness rather than strength, failing to recognize that it required far more courage and discipline to absorb punishment without retaliating than it would have taken to lash out in response to provocation. The systematic nature of Connor's harassment campaign began to attract attention from other students, some of whom found the entertainment value in watching Connor dismantle another victim, while others began to feel uncomfortable with the increasingly mean-spirited nature of the attacks. Emma Rodriguez, the school newspaper editor, who had been observing the situation with growing concern, found herself torn between her instinct to intervene and her recognition that any direct confrontation with Connor would likely result in her becoming his next target. Emma had noticed Danny from his first day at Riverside High, not because he stood out, but because of his obvious efforts to remain unnoticed. Her journalist's instincts had been triggered by the careful way he moved through the school and the hyper-vigilant awareness he displayed in crowded areas. There was something about Danny that didn't match the typical profile of a shy transfer student, and Emma's attempts to research his background had yielded frustratingly little information about his life in Portland or the circumstances that had brought his family to Millbrook. Connor's escalating harassment of Danny provided Emma with an opportunity to observe both the victim and the aggressor under pressure, and what she saw troubled her more than the simple bullying that was obvious to any casual observer. Danny's responses to Connor's provocations revealed layers of self-control and situational awareness that seemed far beyond what would be expected from an ordinary teenager, while Connor's increasing frustration suggested that he was encountering resistance that he didn't understand and couldn't overcome through his usual methods. The situation reached a new level of intensity during Danny's 4th week at Riverside High, when Connor decided that subtle psychological pressure was insufficient to achieve his goals and began incorporating more direct physical harassment into his campaign. The shift from verbal provocation to physical intimidation represented a significant escalation that would test Danny's commitment to nonviolence in ways that Connor couldn't have anticipated. The first incident occurred in the crowded hallway between 3rd and 4th periods, when Connor deliberately shouldered into Danny while he was retrieving books from his locker. The impact was hard enough to slam Danny against the metal doors and send his books scattering across the floor, but it was delivered with enough apparent clumsiness to maintain the appearance of an accident to any faculty members who might have been observing. Danny absorbed the impact without comment, gathering his scattered belongings with the same methodical patience he brought to everything else. Connor waited nearby, ostensibly helping to collect the fallen items while actually positioning himself to deliver additional accidental contact if Danny showed any sign of retaliation. When Danny simply retrieved his books and continued toward his next class without acknowledging the incident, Connor found himself frustrated by the lack of dramatic response that would have provided good content for Ryan's cameras. The pattern continued over several days, with Connor and his friends subjecting Danny to an increasingly aggressive series of accidents and misunderstandings that pushed the boundaries of what could be explained away as coincidental contact. Danny endured shoves in crowded hallways, deliberate trips that sent him stumbling, and strategic positioning that forced him to navigate around human obstacles that appeared wherever he tried to go. Through all of this harassment, Danny maintained his composure with a consistency that began to unnerve even Blake and Ryan, who had expected their escalating campaign to produce visible results by this point. Connor's growing frustration with Danny's refusal to break down or fight back led him to take increasingly desperate measures to provoke the reaction he needed to create compelling content for his social media channels. The breaking point came on a Friday afternoon, when Connor decided that conventional harassment tactics were insufficient to crack Danny's psychological armor, and that more extreme measures would be necessary to achieve the dramatic confrontation that his reputation and his audience demanded. He had spent the previous evening planning an elaborate scenario that would force Danny into a position where he would have no choice but to reveal whatever he was hiding beneath his carefully constructed facade of vulnerability. Connor's plan called for a public humiliation so complete and degrading that no amount of self-discipline would be sufficient to endure it without breaking. He would corner Danny in a location where escape would be impossible, surround him with an audience that would document every moment of his breakdown, and subject him to the kind of psychological torture that would strip away every defense and reveal the truth that Connor was convinced lay hidden beneath Danny's quiet exterior. What Connor failed to understand was that the truth he was so eager to uncover was far more dangerous than anything he had encountered in his previous campaigns, and that in pushing Danny beyond his breaking point, he would be unleashing forces that could not be controlled or contained by the social media strategies that had served him so well in the past. Emma Rodriguez had always possessed an uncanny ability to read people, a skill that had served her well in her role as editor of the Riverside High newspaper and had earned her a reputation as someone who could uncover stories that others missed. Her sharp brown eyes, framed by the kind of wire-rimmed glasses that suggested serious intellectual pursuits, had a way of seeing through carefully constructed facades to the truth that lay beneath. It was this same perceptive quality that had drawn her attention to Danny Hayes from almost the moment he had arrived at their school. Unlike her classmates, who saw only what Danny wanted them to see, a quiet, unremarkable transfer student who preferred to blend into the background, Emma had noticed the subtle inconsistencies in his presentation that suggested a much more complex individual. The way he moved through crowded hallways with an efficiency that seemed almost choreographed, never bumping into anyone despite the chaos around him, spoke of spatial awareness that went far beyond normal teenage navigation skills. His choice of seating in every classroom and public space demonstrated a tactical mindset that prioritized visibility and escape routes over comfort or social convenience. Most intriguingly, Emma had observed the way Danny's eyes constantly swept his environment, cataloging potential threats and tracking movement patterns with the kind of hypervigilance typically associated with military training or law enforcement. Backgrounds. These observations had prompted her to begin what amounted to an informal investigation into Danny's background, though her efforts to uncover information about his life in Portland had yielded frustratingly little concrete evidence to support her growing suspicions that there was far more to the new student than met the eye. Emma's journalistic instincts had been further aroused by Connor Mitchell's obvious interest in Danny, particularly given Connor's reputation for targeting students who possessed secrets worth exploiting. Connor's harassment campaigns typically followed predictable patterns, beginning with subtle psychological pressure and escalating through increasingly aggressive confrontations, until his victims either broke down completely or fought back in ways that provided excellent content for his social media empire. Emma had documented several of these campaigns for potential articles about bullying at Riverside High, though her stories had consistently been blocked by faculty advisors who preferred to avoid drawing attention to problems that might reflect poorly on the school's administration. The systematic nature of Connor's current campaign against Danny represented something different from his usual operations, however, displaying a level of persistence and escalation that suggested Connor believed he had found a particularly valuable target. Emma's observations of their interactions revealed a dynamic that troubled her more than simple bullying, as Connor's growing frustration with Danny's refusal to break down indicated that he was encountering resistance he didn't understand and couldn't overcome through conventional intimidation tactics. What concerned Emma most was Danny's response to the escalating harassment, which demonstrated a level of self-control and discipline that seemed almost superhuman in its consistency. While other students subjected to Connor's campaigns typically showed obvious signs of stress, fear, or anger, Danny maintained his composure with a steadiness that suggested either remarkable emotional maturity or extensive training in managing high-pressure situations. The few moments when his carefully maintained facade had slipped brief flashes of something harder and more dangerous in his eyes when Connor pushed too far had convinced Emma that Danny was not the helpless victim that Connor believed him to be. Emma's growing concern about the situation had led her to begin documenting the harassment campaign with the same thoroughness that Connor's friend Ryan brought to his video recordings, though her purposes were entirely different. where Ryan sought to capture dramatic moments that would generate social media engagement. Emma was building a case file that she hoped might eventually be used to expose Connor's systematic bullying and protect future victims from similar treatment. Her photographs and detailed notes chronicled the escalating pattern of harassment, while also capturing the subtle signs that suggested Danny might not remain passive indefinitely. The shift in dynamics became apparent to Emma during the fourth week of Connor's campaign, when she observed a conversation between Danny and another student that revealed depths to his character that his public persona had concealed. Jake Wilson, a sophomore who struggled with social anxiety and had been one of Connor's previous targets, had approached Danny during lunch period with obvious nervousness about initiating contact with someone who might reject his friendship attempts. Emma watched from across the cafeteria as Jake hesitantly asked if he could sit at Danny's usually solitary table, his body language telegraphing his expectation of rejection or dismissal. Danny's response surprised Emma with its warmth and genuine interest, as he not only welcomed Jake's company, but actively engaged him in conversation that seemed designed to put the younger student at ease. The transformation in Danny's demeanor during this interaction revealed a natural kindness and empathy that stood in stark contrast to his usual guarded isolation. Over the following days, Emma observed several similar interactions as Danny began to form tentative friendships with other students who occupied the margins of Riverside High's social hierarchy. His circle gradually expanded to include Maria Santos, a quiet girl who spent most of her free time in the art room working on elaborate paintings, and David Chun, an academically gifted student whose passion for chess had earned him more mockery than admiration from his classmates. The common thread among Danny's new friends seemed to be their status as outsiders or former victims of bullying, suggesting that Danny possessed an intuitive ability to recognize and connect with others who had experienced social persecution. These developing friendships provided Emma with opportunities to observe Danny in more relaxed social situations, and what she saw confirmed her suspicions that his carefully maintained facade concealed depths that would surprise those who knew him only superficially. When Jake mentioned struggling with bullies in his previous classes, Danny offered advice that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of predator-prey dynamics and defensive psychology. His suggestions were practical and effective, focusing on strategies for avoiding confrontation while projecting confidence that would deter potential aggressors. Emma also noticed that Danny's presence seemed to have a protective effect on his new friends, as students who had previously been easy targets for casual harassment found themselves left alone when Danny was nearby. The mechanism behind this protection wasn't immediately obvious, as Danny never directly confronted potential bullies or made threatening gestures that might escalate situations into violence. Instead, his mere presence seemed to create an invisible barrier that deterred aggressive behavior through subtle but unmistakable signals that intervention would be both swift and decisive if harassment occurred. The psychological effect of Danny's protective presence extended beyond his immediate friend group, as word began to spread through the school's underground communication networks that the quiet new kid was someone to be approached with caution. Students who had witnessed Connor's unsuccessful attempts to break Danny's composure shared their observations with friends, creating a mythology around Danny that grew with each retelling. Some stories credited him with martial arts expertise. Others suggested military or law enforcement backgrounds in his family, while a few more creative narratives proposed that he was in witness protection or had been expelled from his previous school for violence. Connor's awareness of these developing rumors only served to increase his frustration with his inability to crack Danny's psychological defenses, as he recognized that his target was beginning to acquire a reputation that might make future harassment more difficult to execute. The whispered stories about Danny's potential dangerousness contradicted Connor's public narrative that portrayed him as a harmless victim, undermining the foundation of Connor's entire campaign and threatening to damage his own reputation as someone who could dominate any target he chose to pursue. The situation reached a critical juncture when Connor discovered that Danny had begun teaching basic self-defense techniques to his small circle of friends during their lunch periods. Gathering in an unused classroom where they could practice without drawing unwanted attention. Ryan's surveillance efforts had captured footage of these informal training sessions, revealing that Danny possessed a level of martial arts expertise that far exceeded anything Connor had suspected. The videos showed Danny demonstrating complex techniques with the fluid precision of someone who had trained extensively, while his patient instruction style suggested deep understanding of both the physical and psychological aspects of self-defense. Connor's reaction to this discovery was a mixture of vindication and alarm, as it confirmed his suspicions about Danny's hidden abilities, while also revealing that his target possessed skills that could pose genuine danger if Danny ever decided to abandon his passive resistance strategy. The footage also provided Connor with concrete evidence to support his theory that Danny had been concealing his true nature, ammunition that he could use to justify escalating his harassment campaign to levels that might finally provoke the dramatic confrontation his audience craved. The revelation about Danny's martial arts background also explained several previously puzzling aspects of his behavior, from his tactical awareness in crowded spaces to his ability to absorb physical harassment without losing his balance or composure. Connor realized that Danny's apparent vulnerability had been carefully constructed to conceal capabilities that would make him a formidable opponent in any direct confrontation, a discovery that both excited and unnerved Connor as he contemplated the implications for his planned escalation. Emma's investigation had independently led her to similar conclusions about Danny's background, though her research had focused more on the circumstances that had brought him to Millbrook than on his specific capabilities. Her inquiries into Portland area news archives had uncovered several intriguing references to incidents involving teenage martial artists, though the deliberately vague reporting and sealed juvenile records made it impossible to confirm whether Danny had been involved in any of these events. The pattern that emerged from her research suggested a family that had relocated to escape publicity or legal complications related to their son's involvement in some kind of violent confrontation. The pieces of the puzzle began falling into place when Emma discovered a local news story from Portland about an attempted robbery at a convenience store that had been thwarted by a teenage customer described only as a minor with martial arts training. The incident had resulted in serious injuries to two adult attackers and had sparked controversy about the use of excessive force in self-defense situations, ultimately leading to legal proceedings that had been sealed due to the offender's age. While the story provided no names or identifying details, the timeline and circumstances aligned perfectly with Emma's theories about Danny's background and the reasons for his family's relocation. This discovery prompted Emma to reconsider her observations of Danny's behavior at Riverside High, viewing his careful avoidance of confrontation in a new light that emphasized the tremendous self-discipline required to maintain his passive stance, despite possessing the ability to defend himself decisively. The promise he had apparently made to avoid violence took on deeper significance when viewed against the backdrop of previous incidents that had resulted in serious consequences, suggesting that Danny's restraint was motivated by genuine understanding of the damage he could inflict if he allowed his training to surface. Connor's plan for the ultimate confrontation began taking shape as he processed the implications of Danny's hidden abilities and considered how to create a scenario that would force his target to reveal his true nature on camera. The knowledge that Danny possessed genuine fighting skills made the potential payoff even greater, as footage of a supposed victim transforming into a dangerous opponent would generate the kind of viral content that could establish Connor's reputation permanently. At the same time, the discovery added an element of real danger to Connor's planned escalation that he hadn't anticipated when he first targeted Danny for harassment. The moral dimensions of the situation became more complex as Connor grappled with the knowledge that Danny was not the helpless victim he had initially appeared to be, raising questions about whether continued harassment could be justified as harmless pranking or represented something more serious. Connor's social media audience had responded enthusiastically to his previous content featuring Danny, with comments and engagement metrics indicating strong demand for more dramatic confrontations that would reveal whatever secrets the mysterious new student was hiding. The pressure to deliver increasingly exciting content had become a driving force in Connor's decision-making process, as his online reputation and growing follower count represented real social capital that translated into opportunities and advantages. Beyond the walls of Riverside High, sponsors had begun approaching him about product placements and promotional partnerships, while his success at creating viral content had attracted attention from talent scouts representing larger social media networks. The potential for his harassment campaign against Danny to generate career-defining content made it difficult for Connor to consider backing down, even as the risks associated with his planned escalation became more apparent. Blake and Ryan found themselves caught between loyalty to Connor and growing unease about the direction their activities were taking, particularly as they began to understand the true nature of their target and the potential consequences of pushing him beyond his breaking point. Blake's athletic background gave him better insight than most into the kinds of damage that trained fighters could inflict, and his observation of Danny's movement patterns and physical conditioning had convinced him that their friend was playing with forces he didn't fully understand or respect. Ryan's technical expertise in video analysis had allowed him to study Danny's defensive reactions frame by frame, revealing subtle indicators of training and capability that were invisible to casual observation. His growing catalog of footage, documenting Danny's responses to harassment, showed a pattern of escalating tension that suggested their target was approaching a breaking point that might result in consequences far beyond anything they had experienced in previous campaigns. The internal dynamics of Connor's group began to shift as the stakes of their activities became clearer, with Blake and Ryan expressing increasing reluctance to participate in the more aggressive harassment tactics that Connor believed were necessary to achieve his goals. Their concerns were both practical and ethical, as they recognized that crossing certain lines might result in serious legal consequences, while also beginning to question the morality of systematically tormenting someone who had done nothing to deserve such treatment. Connor's response to his friends' growing reservations was to become more insistent about the importance of their mission and more dismissive of their concerns about potential consequences. He argued that Danny's concealment of his abilities represented a form of deception that justified aggressive investigation, while the potential for viral content outweighed any risks associated with their escalating campaign. Connor's increasing obsession with breaking through Danny's defenses had begun to cloud his judgment about appropriate boundaries and acceptable risks. The situation that had begun as routine bullying had evolved into something approaching psychological warfare, with Connor employing increasingly sophisticated tactics designed to isolate Danny socially and create the kind of pressure that would force him to abandon his carefully maintained restraint. The systematic nature of the campaign had begun to attract attention from faculty members who recognized the signs of coordinated harassment, though the subtle nature of many incidents made it difficult to document violations of specific school policies. Emma's documentation of the harassment campaign had grown into a comprehensive case file that included photographs, video footage, and detailed timelines showing the escalating pattern of Connor's activities. Her investigation had also uncovered evidence of Connor's previous campaigns against other students, revealing a systematic approach to bullying that went far beyond the spontaneous conflicts that typically characterize teenage social dynamics. The scope and sophistication of Connor's operations convinced Emma that intervention would be necessary to prevent the situation from escalating to violence. though her options for effective action were limited by institutional reluctance to acknowledge the problem. The approaching climax of Connor's campaign against Danny had begun to generate anticipation throughout the school, as students became aware that some kind of major confrontation was inevitable given the escalating tensions between the two. The social media buzz around their conflict had spread beyond Riverside High to other schools in the district, creating an audience eager for dramatic resolution that added pressure for Connor to deliver a spectacular finale to his months-long harassment campaign. Danny's awareness of the building pressure had become impossible to ignore as Connor's tactics grew more aggressive and his surveillance efforts more obvious. The promise he had made to his mother weighed heavily on his conscience as he struggled to maintain his peaceful stance in the face of increasingly direct provocation. But the presence of his new friends and the knowledge that others might be inspired by his example to resist bullying provided additional motivation to avoid the kind of violent response that had complicated his life in Portland. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test everyone involved in ways they couldn't anticipate. As Connor prepared to implement his most aggressive harassment strategy yet, Danny wrestled with the challenge of maintaining his principles under pressure that was designed specifically to break his resolve. The collision between Connor's need for dramatic content and Danny's commitment to avoiding violence was approaching a moment of truth that would reveal the true character of both young men and determine the future dynamics of their school community. The October wind carried the first hints of winter as it swept across the parking lot behind Riverside High School, rustling through the pile of leaves that had gathered against the chain-link fence separating school property from the adjacent park. Danny Hayes stood perfectly still near his locker, his breathing controlled and measured as he processed the decision that had been crystallizing in his mind over the past several sleepless nights. The internal war between his promise to his mother and his growing understanding that passive resistance might no longer be sufficient had reached a resolution that brought him both relief and profound sadness. The transformation in Danny's mindset hadn't occurred suddenly, but rather through a gradual accumulation of pressure that had finally exceeded his capacity to absorb without response. Connor's escalating harassment campaign had pushed beyond the boundaries of typical teenage bullying into territory that Danny recognized as genuinely dangerous, not just to himself but to the other students who were beginning to look to him for protection and guidance. The realization that his continued passivity might actually enable Connor to harm others had forced Danny to reconsider the wisdom of maintaining his peaceful stance at any cost. The promise he had made to his mother in Portland carried the weight of genuine love and respect, born from her terror at seeing her son involved in violence that had hospitalized 2 adult attackers and generated media attention that had followed their family for months. Danny understood the depth of her fear and the sacrifices she had made to give him a fresh start in Millbrook, but he also recognized that his current situation was approaching a point where intervention would become necessary regardless of his personal preferences about avoiding confrontation. Danny's martial arts training had always emphasized the concept of proportional response, teaching him that true mastery lay not in the ability to inflict maximum damage but in the wisdom to apply exactly the amount of force necessary to resolve a conflict without causing unnecessary harm. His instructors in Portland had drilled into him the understanding that violence should always be the last resort, but they had also prepared him to recognize situations where that last resort became unavoidable and to act decisively when that moment arrived. The decision-making process that Danny had undergone over the past week involved careful analysis of all available alternatives, from seeking adult intervention to simply enduring Connor's harassment until graduation provided escape from their shared environment. Each option carried its own risks and potential consequences, and Danny's methodical evaluation of these possibilities had led him to conclude that a direct confrontation might actually represent the path that minimized overall harm to everyone involved. Connor's obsession with documenting his harassment campaign for social media had created evidence that could potentially be used to expose his systematic bullying tactics. But Danny understood that such evidence would only be meaningful if adults were willing to acknowledge and address the problem. His observations of faculty responses to previous incidents suggested that institutional intervention was unlikely to be effective, particularly given Connor's family connections and his carefully maintained public image as a successful student. Athlete. The psychological pressure that Connor had been applying through his systematic harassment had begun to affect Danny's academic performance and social relationships in ways that threatened to undermine the fresh start his family had sacrificed so much to provide. Danny's grades were beginning to suffer as his concentration was disrupted by the constant need to remain alert for potential confrontations, while his developing friendships were being strained by his friends' concerns about becoming targets themselves simply through association with him. Most troubling to Danny was his growing awareness that Connor's tactics were becoming more sophisticated and potentially dangerous as his frustration with Danny's resistance increased. The shift from psychological pressure to physical harassment represented an escalation that Danny recognized as the beginning of a cycle that would continue to intensify until it reached a breaking point that might result in serious injury to someone involved. The knowledge that Connor was now actively seeking opportunities to provoke violent responses suggested that the situation had moved beyond simple bullying into territory where defensive action might become necessary. The martial arts philosophy that had shaped Danny's approach to conflict resolution emphasized the importance of taking control of dangerous situations before they spiraled beyond anyone's ability to manage them safely. Danny's training had taught him to recognize the warning signs that preceded serious violence and to intervene early when those signs appeared, even if such intervention required the use of force that might appear disproportionate to outside observers who didn't understand the dynamics involved. Connor's plan for the ultimate confrontation had been taking shape over several days of careful preparation, as he designed a scenario that would force Danny into a position where maintaining his passive stance would become impossible. The location he had selected for this final encounter was perfect for his purposes, isolated enough to prevent adult intervention while remaining accessible to the audience of students, whose presence would ensure maximum social media impact for whatever dramatic footage Ryan would capture. The abandoned maintenance building behind the school gymnasium had become a gathering place for students seeking privacy for activities that weren't officially sanctioned by school administration, from smoking cigarettes to conducting the kind of social dramas that required audience participation but couldn't risk teacher oversight. Connor had used this location for several previous harassment campaigns, and his familiarity with its layout and sightlines made it ideal for the elaborate humiliation scenario he was planning to implement. Connor's scheme involved cornering Danny in the maintenance building during the lunch period, when the area would be relatively deserted but not completely empty of potential witnesses. He would surround Danny with Blake and Ryan while other students formed an audience circle. That would prevent escape while ensuring documentation of whatever breakdown Connor expected to provoke. The psychological pressure of being trapped and surrounded would be amplified by the presence of cameras that would capture every moment of Danny's humiliation for later distribution across social media platforms. The specific nature of the humiliation that Connor was planning represented an escalation beyond anything he had attempted in previous campaigns, designed to be so degrading and psychologically devastating that no amount of self-control would be sufficient to endure it without breaking. Connor had decided that forcing Danny to crawl on his hands and knees while barking like a dog would provide the perfect combination of physical degradation and psychological torture that would strip away every defense and reveal the truth about Danny's character that Connor was convinced lay hidden beneath his carefully maintained facade. The plan also included provisions for escalating the humiliation if Danny's initial response wasn't dramatic enough to satisfy Connor's content creation needs, with additional degrading acts prepared that would push his victim beyond any conceivable breaking point. Connor's confidence in his ability to execute this plan successfully was based on his previous experiences with similar tactics, though none of his previous targets had possessed Danny's background or capabilities. Blake and Ryan's reluctance to participate in Connor's most aggressive harassment tactics had been overcome through a combination of social pressure and Connor's persuasive arguments about the importance of their mission to expose Danny's deception. Connor had convinced his friends that Danny's concealment of his martial arts abilities represented a form of fraud that justified whatever measures were necessary to reveal the truth, while the potential for viral content that could launch their social media careers outweighed any temporary discomfort they might feel about their methods. The morning of the planned confrontation arrived with the kind of crisp autumn weather that made Riverside High's campus look particularly inviting, though the beauty of the changing leaves and clear blue sky was lost on the participants in the drama that was about to unfold. Connor moved through his morning classes with barely contained excitement, his anticipation for the afternoon's events making it difficult to concentrate on academic work that seemed trivial compared to the social media triumph he was planning to achieve. Danny's awareness that something significant was approaching had been building throughout the week as Connor's surveillance efforts became more obvious and his provocative comments took on an edge of finality that suggested a climactic confrontation was imminent. The subtle changes in the behavior of other students, who seemed to sense that some kind of major event was approaching, confirmed Danny's assessment that Connor was preparing for an escalation that would bring their conflict to a head. Emma Rodriguez had also detected the shift in atmosphere around the school, as whispered conversations and furtive glances suggested that word of Connor's planned confrontation was spreading through the student body despite efforts to keep the details secret. Her documentation of Connor's harassment campaign had reached a level of detail that would support serious disciplinary action if school administrators could be convinced to review the evidence, but Emma understood that institutional intervention would likely come too late to prevent whatever Connor was planning to implement. The lunch period arrived with an electric tension that seemed to permeate the entire school, as students who were aware of Connor's plan positioned themselves to observe the confrontation, while others simply sensed that something dramatic was about to occur. Danny made his way toward the cafeteria with the same measured pace he had maintained throughout his time at Riverside High, though observers who knew what to look for might have noticed subtle changes in his posture and movement, patterns that suggested a heightened state of readiness. Connor's interception of Danny in the hallway leading to the cafeteria was executed with the kind of casual precision that he had perfected through months of practice, positioning himself and his friends to surround their target while maintaining the appearance of a chance encounter. The invitation for Danny to join them outside for a conversation was delivered with sufficient ambiguity that it could be interpreted as either a friendly gesture or a threat, depending on the observer's knowledge of their history. Danny's acceptance of Connor's invitation surprised several students, who had expected him to attempt avoidance or seek adult supervision, but his calm agreement to accompany Connor and his friends toward the maintenance building suggested a level of confidence that seemed inconsistent with his usual careful avoidance of confrontational situations. The small crowd that began following them toward the designated location grew larger as word spread through the school's informal communication networks that the long-anticipated confrontation was finally about to occur. The maintenance building's interior was exactly as Connor had remembered it, with concrete walls that would provide excellent acoustics for capturing audio, while the large windows would ensure adequate lighting for Ryan's video equipment. The space had been arranged to create a natural arena, with debris and old equipment pushed against the walls to leave a clear central area where the main action would take place. Connor's familiarity with the location gave him confidence that he could control the dynamics of whatever occurred within its walls. Danny entered the building with the same composed demeanor he had maintained throughout Connor's harassment campaign, though careful observers might have noticed that his positioning and movement patterns had shifted subtly to reflect a more tactical awareness of his environment. His eyes swept the room methodically, cataloging exit routes and potential weapons, while his body language remained relaxed enough to avoid telegraphing defensive preparations to his opponents. Connor's opening gambit was designed to establish psychological dominance through the sheer audacity of his demands, as he informed Danny that the time for pretense had ended and that he would now demonstrate his true character through a series of degrading acts that would be documented for posterity. The specific demand that Danny crawl on his hands and knees while barking like a dog was delivered with the kind of casual cruelty that had characterized Connor's most successful humiliation campaigns, accompanied by the implicit threat that refusal would result in physical consequences. The moment that followed Connor's demand seemed to stretch into infinity as everyone present waited to see how Danny would respond to this ultimate test of his commitment to avoiding confrontation. The silence in the maintenance building was broken only by the sound of Ryan's camera equipment and the distant noise of normal school activities, continuing in blissful ignorance of the drama unfolding in their isolated location. Danny's response began with a slight smile that seemed to surprise Connor with its genuineness, as if he had just received news that brought him profound relief, rather than the devastating humiliation that the demand was designed to inflict. The transformation that followed was so subtle at first that most observers didn't immediately recognize what was happening, as Danny's carefully maintained facade of vulnerability began to dissolve like mist in the morning sun. "You know what, Connor?" Danny said, his voice carrying a warmth that seemed completely out of place in the confrontational atmosphere that had been building for weeks. "I think you might actually be doing me a favor here." The comment appeared to confuse Connor, who had expected either compliance with his demands or desperate attempts to negotiate an escape from the humiliation he had planned. Danny's apparent appreciation for the situation represented a response that fell outside the parameters of Connor's experience with previous victims, introducing an element of uncertainty that threatened to disrupt his carefully orchestrated scenario. "I've been carrying around this promise I made to my mother," Danny continued, his tone becoming more conversational as he spoke. "A promise to avoid confrontation, to walk away from trouble, to never let my training surface again. It's been eating at me for months, watching you hurt people and knowing I could stop it, but choosing not to act because of a commitment I made after a very different situation, in a very different place." The reference to Danny's training sent a ripple of anticipation through the gathered crowd, as students who had heard rumors about his martial arts background realized they might be about to witness something far more dramatic than the simple breakdown that Connor had been promising. Connor himself felt a flutter of unease as he processed the implications of Danny's words and began to suspect that his careful plan might not unfold according to his expectations. "But you've just solved my problem," Danny said, his smile widening as he gestured toward Ryan's camera equipment. "See, my promise was about avoiding unnecessary confrontation, about not using my abilities unless there was genuine need for protection. And by demanding that I crawl around and bark like a dog while you film it for your entertainment, you've just created exactly the kind of situation where that protection becomes necessary." The shift in Danny's posture as he spoke was so gradual that most observers didn't notice it happening, but those with training in martial arts or combat sports might have recognized the subtle changes that indicated a transition from passive awareness to active preparation. His weight distribution became more centered, his hands moved into positions that appeared casual but provided optimal reaction time, and his breathing shifted into the controlled pattern that preceded explosive action. Connor's realization that his carefully planned scenario was beginning to slip beyond his control prompted him to attempt reassertion of dominance through the kind of aggressive posturing that had served him well in previous confrontations. His demand that Danny stop talking and comply with his instructions was delivered with increased volume and emphasis, backed by Blake and Ryan moving into positions that would support physical enforcement if psychological pressure proved insufficient. "You see, Connor," Danny continued, apparently unaffected by the escalating threats around him, "what you never understood is that I wasn't hiding from you because I was afraid of you. I was protecting you from me. But since you've made it clear that you're determined to push this to its conclusion, regardless of the consequences, I think it's time we gave your audience the show they came here to see." The explosion of movement that followed Danny's final words was so fast and precise that Ryan's camera equipment, despite being operated by someone specifically positioned to capture dramatic action, could barely track the sequence of events that unfolded in the maintenance building. Danny's transition from apparent passivity to decisive action occurred with the kind of fluid efficiency that spoke of thousands of hours of training and the kind of situational awareness that could only be developed through experience with genuine danger. Connor's first indication that his scenario had gone completely wrong came when he found himself flat on his back on the concrete floor, staring up at the ceiling while trying to process how he had gotten there. The technique that Danny had used to put him down was so perfectly executed that Connor hadn't even felt the contact that preceded his sudden change in altitude, leaving him with the disorienting sensation of having simply materialized in a horizontal position without any clear memory of the transition. Blake's attempt to intervene on his friend's behalf lasted approximately 3 seconds before he joined Connor on the floor, courtesy of a sweep that sent his legs out from under him, followed by a controlled takedown that deposited him next to Connor with the kind of precision that demonstrated complete mastery of leverage and momentum. Ryan, who had been focused on operating his camera equipment, found himself gently but firmly relieved of his recording devices and guided to a sitting position against the wall where he could observe the remainder of the proceedings without risk of interference. The entire sequence had been executed with such clinical efficiency that the gathered crowd of students initially remained silent, struggling to process the sudden reversal of power dynamics that had transformed their expectations of Danny's humiliation into something approaching awe at his demonstration of capabilities that none of them had suspected he possessed. The contrast between Danny's previous passivity and his current display of martial prowess was so dramatic that several observers questioned whether they were witnessing the same person, who had endured weeks of harassment without apparent resistance. Danny stood over Connor's prone form with the kind of relaxed confidence that came from complete control of the situation, his breathing steady and his posture indicating that the brief physical exchange had required minimal effort despite its dramatic results. The transformation in his demeanor was complete, as the carefully constructed facade of vulnerability had been replaced by the bearing of someone who possessed genuine authority and the skills to enforce it when necessary. "Now, Connor," Danny said, his voice carrying the patient tone of a teacher addressing a particularly slow student, "I believe you had some specific requests about how you wanted this encounter to proceed. Something about crawling and barking, if I remember correctly." The suggestion that their roles might be reversed sent a wave of shocked murmurs through the crowd of observers, as students began to understand that they might be witnessing something far more dramatic than the routine bullying incident they had expected to see. Connor's face flushed red as he processed the implications of Danny's words and realized that his own humiliation tactics were about to be turned back on him in front of an audience that included his social media followers. "You can't be serious," Connor managed to say, his voice cracking slightly as he struggled to regain some measure of control over a situation that had completely escaped his management. "This is assault. I'll have you arrested. My father knows people who can make sure you're expelled and charged with criminal battery." Danny's response was a gentle laugh that seemed to find genuine amusement in Connor's threats, though his positioned standing over his defeated opponent, never wavered. "Assault?" he repeated, as if testing the word for accuracy. "Connor, I haven't laid a hand on you in anger. What you just experienced was a demonstration of defensive martial arts techniques designed to neutralize aggression without causing injury. If you're hurt, it's because you fell down, not because I struck you." The technical accuracy of Danny's statement was lost on most of the observers, but those with any experience in martial arts recognized the distinction he was making between offensive and defensive applications of force. Danny's techniques had been selected specifically to end the confrontation quickly while minimizing the risk of serious injury to his opponents, demonstrating a level of control and ethical consideration that spoke to extensive training in the perpetually philosophical as well as physical aspects of combat arts. "As for having me arrested," Danny continued, "I'd like to point out that we have excellent video documentation of you threatening me with physical harm if I didn't comply with your demands for degrading behavior. Ryan's been very thorough in capturing everything that led up to this moment, and I suspect a review of that footage will show that I acted in clear self-defense against a coordinated assault by 3 individuals in an isolated location." Connor's realization that his own documentation efforts might be used as evidence against him rather than proof of Danny's victimization added another layer of humiliation to his rapidly deteriorating situation. The social media strategy that had been designed to showcase his dominance over the mysterious new student had instead captured his complete defeat and the revelation that his victim possessed capabilities that made Connor's harassment campaign appear not just cruel but foolishly dangerous. "So here's what's going to happen," Danny said, his tone remaining conversational despite the authority it carried. "You're going to experience exactly what you planned for me to experience, because I think it's important for everyone here to understand the difference between choosing to be kind and being unable to defend yourself. The difference between genuine strength and the kind of weakness that can only feel powerful by hurting others." The crowd of students that had gathered to witness Connor's triumph found themselves instead observing his complete humiliation. As Danny implemented the exact scenario that Connor had designed for his victim, the demand that Connor crawl across the concrete floor while barking like a dog was delivered with the same casual cruelty that Connor had employed, though Danny's tone carried an educational quality that suggested the exercise was designed to teach rather than simply to degrade. Connor's initial refusal to comply with Danny's demands lasted until Danny explained that he could either participate voluntarily or Danny could demonstrate some of the more aggressive techniques he had learned during his years of training. Gentle but unmistakable threat carried enough conviction to overcome Connor's resistance, as he began to understand that his options had been reduced to choosing the manner of his humiliation rather than avoiding it entirely. The sight of Connor Mitchell, the self-proclaimed king of Riverside High's social hierarchy, crawling across the maintenance building floor while producing the barking sounds he had demanded from Danny created a moment of cognitive dissonance that left many observers struggling to process what they were witnessing. The reversal of power dynamics was so complete and so sudden that several students began recording the scene with their own devices, ensuring that Connor's humiliation would be documented from multiple angles and perspectives. Blake and Ryan's attempts to intervene on their friend's behalf were gently but firmly discouraged by Danny, who positioned himself to maintain visual contact with all 3 of his former tormentors while ensuring that Connor completed the full performance he had originally designed for his victim. The efficiency with which Danny managed the situation while maintaining complete control demonstrated a level of tactical awareness that impressed even those students who had suspected he might possess martial arts training. The breaking point came when Connor, overwhelmed by the combination of physical discomfort, psychological humiliation, and the knowledge that his degradation was being captured for the same social media platforms where he had planned to showcase Danny's suffering, began to cry with the desperate hopelessness of someone whose entire worldview had just collapsed around him. The tears that streamed down his face as he continued to bark on command provided exactly the kind of dramatic footage that he had sought to create, though the roles had been reversed in ways that would haunt him for years to come. Danny's observation of Connor's emotional breakdown seemed to trigger a shift in his approach, as if the sight of genuine distress had activated the compassionate aspects of his character that his previous restraint had been designed to protect. He called an end to Connor's performance and helped him to his feet with the same gentle consideration he might have shown to any student in distress, demonstrating that his actions had been motivated by justice rather than cruelty. "The difference between us, Connor," Danny explained as he assisted his former tormentor in regaining his composure, "is that I know when to stop. You've just learned what it feels like to be powerless and humiliated, and I hope that knowledge will help you make better choices about how you treat other people in the future." The aftermath of the confrontation saw a complete transformation in the social dynamics of Riverside High School, as word of Connor's defeat and Danny's revealed capabilities spread throughout the student body within hours of the incident. The video footage that Ryan had captured, along with the recordings made by other students, created a comprehensive record of events that made it impossible for Connor to construct an alternative narrative about what had occurred in the maintenance building. Connor's social media empire, built on the systematic humiliation of others, crumbled overnight as his followers abandoned him in favor of new accounts that celebrated his downfall and elevated Danny as an unlikely hero who had stood up to the school's most feared bully. The irony that Connor's own documentation strategies had captured his defeat was not lost on the student body, many of whom had been victims of his previous campaigns and found vindication in watching their tormentor experience the same helplessness he had inflicted on others. Danny's approach to his newfound status as a folk hero demonstrated the same thoughtful consideration that had characterized his previous behavior, as he actively discouraged attempts to celebrate Connor's humiliation while focusing instead on the lessons that could be learned from their confrontation. His formation of an informal self-defense club that met after school provided practical training for students who wanted to protect themselves, while his emphasis on conflict avoidance and de-escalation techniques reflected his understanding that violence should always remain a last resort. The changes in Connor's behavior following his defeat were profound and lasting, as the experience of genuine powerlessness had shattered his previous assumptions about strength and dominance in ways that forced him to reconsider his entire approach to social interaction. His gradual transformation from predator to someone who actively worked to protect potential victims demonstrated that even the most committed bullies could change when confronted with the consequences of their actions. Emma Rodriguez's documentation of the entire harassment campaign and its resolution provided the foundation for a series of articles about bullying and conflict resolution that earned recognition from educational organizations throughout the state. Her analysis of the psychological dynamics that had driven Connor's behavior and the causes of the psychological behavior and the analysis of the psychological dynamics that had driven Connor's behavior and the factors that had enabled Danny's successful resistance became required reading in anti-bullying programs at schools throughout the region. The maintenance building, where the confrontation had occurred, became something of a shrine for students who had been inspired by Danny's example, though Danny himself discouraged such veneration while emphasizing that the real victory lay not in his physical triumph over Connor, but in the creation of a school environment where systematic harassment was no longer tolerated by the student body. His vision of Riverside High as a place where strength was measured by kindness rather than the ability to hurt others slowly became reality as students internalized the lessons of his example. Years later, Connor would reflect on that afternoon in the maintenance building as the moment when his life had taken a turn toward becoming the person he had always been capable of being, while Danny would remember it as the day he learned that sometimes the greatest act of mercy is showing someone The consequences of their choices before those consequences become irreversible. The 20 seconds that had transformed their relationship from predator and prey to teacher and student had created ripples that would continue to influence the lives of everyone who witnessed their confrontation for decades to come. The transformation of Riverside High School in the weeks following the storage room confrontation was nothing short of remarkable. As if Danny Hayes had somehow altered the fundamental social ecosystem that governed teenage interactions throughout the campus. Students who had previously walked the hallways with hunched shoulders and downcast eyes now moved with visible confidence, their posture reflecting an understanding that systematic harassment was no longer an accepted part of their daily experience. The ripple effects of Connor Mitchell's public humiliation had spread far beyond the immediate participants, creating a new social order where strength was measured by kindness rather than the ability to inflict suffering on others. Emma Rodriguez documented these changes with the thoroughness of a sociologist studying a cultural revolution, her journalist's eye capturing the subtle shifts in behavior that marked the emergence of a more compassionate school environment. Her interviews with students who had previously been targets of bullying revealed a consistent theme of empowerment and hope, as young people who had resigned themselves to years of harassment suddenly found themselves able to walk through their school without fear. The transformation was particularly evident in the cafeteria, where seating arrangements that had been rigidly enforced through intimidation gave way to a more fluid social dynamic that allowed genuine friendships to develop across traditional hierarchical boundaries. Connor's fall from social media stardom had been swift and complete, his carefully cultivated online persona crumbling as followers abandoned his accounts in favor of new voices that celebrated courage and authenticity rather than cruelty and exploitation. The viral video of his breakdown in the storage room had spread far beyond Riverside High, reaching audiences across the region who shared it as an example of justice finally being served to someone who had built his reputation on the suffering of others. The irony that his own documentation strategies had provided the evidence of his defeat was discussed extensively in online forums dedicated to anti-bullying advocacy, where his case became a cautionary tale about the dangers of systematic harassment. The psychological impact of his humiliation extended far beyond the immediate embarrassment of being forced to crawl and bark like a dog in front of his peers. Connor found himself experiencing emotions that had been foreign to him throughout his reign as Riverside's premier bully, including genuine empathy for the victims of his previous campaigns and a growing understanding of the psychological damage he had inflicted through years of calculated cruelty. The sleepless nights he spent replaying his encounter with Danny forced him to confront the reality that his actions had caused real harm to real people, many of whom continued to suffer from the trauma he had deliberately inflicted. Connor's parents, initially prepared to pursue legal action against Danny and his family, found their anger deflated when they reviewed the extensive video, evidence that documented their son's systematic harassment campaign. The footage that Ryan Kim had captured over several weeks revealed a pattern of behavior that went far beyond typical teenage conflicts, showing Connor deliberately targeting vulnerable students with sophisticated psychological tactics designed to maximize emotional damage. The realization that their son had been operating what amounted to a harassment enterprise, complete with strategic planning and social media distribution, forced them to acknowledge that Danny's response had been both proportionate and necessary. The family therapy sessions that followed Connor's defeat became a journey of discovery for parents who had been blind to the true nature of their son's activities at school. Connor's mother, a successful real estate agent who had always taken pride in her son's popularity and social media success, struggled to reconcile the confident young man she knew at home with the systematic bully revealed in the surveillance footage. Her tears during one particularly difficult session, when Connor finally admitted to the full extent of his harassment campaigns, marked the beginning of a healing process that would take years to complete but would ultimately strengthen their family relationships in unexpected ways. Connor's transformation from predator to advocate didn't happen overnight, but rather through a gradual process of education and self-reflection that was guided by both professional counseling and the unexpected mentorship of Danny Hayes himself. The former victim's willingness to engage with his former tormentor in constructive dialogue demonstrated a level of maturity and forgiveness that impressed even the school administrators who had initially been skeptical about Danny's methods of conflict resolution. Their conversations, which began as awkward attempts at apology and gradually evolved into genuine discussions about power dynamics and social responsibility, became a model for restorative justice that would later be implemented in schools throughout the district. Danny's approach to his newfound status as a folk hero reflected the same thoughtful consideration that had characterized his behavior throughout Connor's harassment campaign. Rather than basking in the adoration of students who wanted to celebrate his triumph, Danny focused his energy on creating sustainable changes that would protect future students from the kind of systematic harassment that Connor had perfected. His self-defense program, which met 3 times a week in the school gymnasium, attracted dozens of participants who learned not just physical techniques, but also the psychological strategies necessary to project confidence and deter potential aggressors. The philosophical foundation of Danny's teaching emphasized the responsibility that came with the ability to defend oneself, drawing on the martial arts principles that had guided his own development as both a fighter and a person. His students learned that true strength lay not in the capacity to inflict harm, but in the wisdom to know when such capacity should be employed, and that the ultimate goal of self-defense training was to create a world where such skills would never be necessary. These lessons resonated deeply with young people who had experienced the powerlessness that came from being unable to protect themselves, giving them not just physical tools, but also the mental framework necessary to break cycles of victimization. Blake Torres and Ryan Kim, Connor's former accomplices in harassment, found themselves grappling with their own guilt and complicity in campaigns that had caused genuine suffering to their classmates. Blake's athletic background had given him insight into the physical aspects of intimidation, and his realization that he had used his size and strength to terrorize smaller students led to a crisis of conscience that ultimately transformed his understanding of what it meant to be strong. His decision to join Danny's self-defense program as an assistant instructor reflected his desire to use his physical advantages to protect rather than threaten, becoming a powerful example of how former bullies could redirect their influence toward positive ends. Ryan's technical expertise, which had been instrumental in documenting and distributing Connor's harassment campaigns, was redirected toward creating educational content that exposed the psychological tactics used by bullies and provided resources for students who found themselves targeted for harassment. His analysis of the video footage he had captured revealed patterns of behavior that were useful for training purposes, helping potential victims recognize the early warning signs of systematic harassment before it escalated to dangerous levels. The irony that his skills in video production, originally used to humiliate others, were now being employed to prevent such humiliation was not lost on Ryan, who found genuine satisfaction in using his talents to protect rather than exploit his fellow students. The administrative response to the storage room incident reflected the complex challenges that schools faced when dealing with situations that fell outside traditional disciplinary frameworks. Principal Waters, a veteran educator who had seen countless conflicts between students, recognized that Danny's intervention had achieved what months of conventional anti-bullying programs had failed to accomplish, effectively ending a harassment campaign that had tormented dozens of students while creating a deterrent effect that protected potential future victims. The fact that Danny's methods had violated school policies regarding physical confrontation created a legal and ethical dilemma that required careful navigation to avoid setting precedents that might encourage vigilante justice. The compromise solution that emerged from extensive discussions between administrators, Parents and student representatives reflected a growing understanding that traditional approaches to bullying prevention were often inadequate when dealing with sophisticated harassment campaigns like Connor's. Danny's self-defense program was officially recognized as a school club, providing institutional support for his educational efforts while establishing clear guidelines about when and how defensive techniques could be appropriately employed. The program's emphasis on de-escalation and conflict avoidance satisfied administrators' concerns about promoting violence, while its practical training components gave students the tools they needed to protect themselves when other options had been exhausted. The ripple effects of Danny's intervention extended far beyond the walls of Riverside High School, as news of his confrontation with Connor spread through social media networks and attracted attention from anti-bullying organizations throughout the region. Educational consultants began studying the incident as an example of how peer intervention could be more effective than adult supervision in addressing systematic harassment, while martial arts instructors incorporated Danny's approach into their own teachings about the responsible use of fighting skills. The story became a case study in restorative justice programs, demonstrating how former adversaries could work together to create positive change when both parties were committed to growth and healing. The long-term impact of the storage room confrontation continued to unfold over the months and years that followed, as students who had witnessed Danny's intervention carried their changed understanding of power dynamics into their adult lives. Many became advocates for anti-bullying programs in their own communities, while others pursued careers in education, counseling, and law enforcement with a deep understanding of how systematic harassment operated and how it could be effectively countered. The lesson that strength could be used to protect rather than exploit became a defining principle for a generation of young people who had seen firsthand how one person's courage could transform an entire community. Connor's journey from notorious bully to anti-harassment advocate took several years to complete, but his eventual transformation became one of the most powerful testimonies to the possibility of redemption and change that emerged from the incident. His speaking engagements at schools throughout the region, where he shared the story of his downfall and subsequent awakening, provided audiences with unique insights into the psychology of bullying from someone who had operated at the highest levels of systematic harassment. His willingness to accept responsibility for the harm he had caused, combined with his detailed knowledge of harassment tactics, made him an effective educator who could reach potential bullies in ways that traditional authority figures could not. Danny's legacy at Riverside High School was ultimately measured not by the dramatic confrontation that had ended Connor's harassment campaign, but by the lasting cultural changes that made such campaigns impossible for future students to sustain. The self-defense program he had established continued to operate years after his graduation, training hundreds of students in both physical techniques and the philosophical principles that governed their use. The school's transformation from a place where systematic harassment was tolerated to one where such behavior was actively resisted by the student body itself represented a fundamental shift in how educational communities could address the challenge of bullying. The friendship that eventually developed between Danny and Connor surprised many observers, but reflected the deep understanding that both young men had gained about the nature of power and responsibility through their confrontation. Their collaboration on anti-bullying initiatives provided a powerful example of how former enemies could work together toward common goals when both were committed to growth and healing. The respect they developed for each other, born from their shared experience of transformation, became a model for restorative justice that influenced educational policies throughout the region. Years later, as both men pursued careers that reflected their changed understanding of strength and service, they would often reflect on the afternoon in the storage room that had changed the trajectory of their lives. For Connor, it represented the moment when he learned that true power came from lifting others up rather than tearing them down. While for Danny, it marked his understanding that sometimes the greatest act of compassion was showing someone the consequences of their choices before those consequences became irreversible. The 20 seconds that had transformed their relationship from predator and prey to teacher and student had created ripples that continued to influence lives and communities, long after they had both moved on to new challenges and opportunities. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.